Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu, and I'm back with another Buddy Staples video. So today I'm going to be talking about Dungeon World. Dungeon World as a whole has some pretty interesting cards, and it relies a lot on either self-synergies or cross-synergies, which makes some of the cards very powerful and splashable. So with that being said, let's get into the list. First, I have Defense Wall. So you can only cast this card during attack on your opponent's turn. You pay 1 gauge, nullify the attack, then it has the added benefit of if you have 5 or less cards in your drop zone, you get to charge 1 gauge. This is a pretty solid generic defense spell. Next, we have Thundermarked Urn. You can only cast this card during an attack on your opponent's turn, and you have no monster in your center, then just nullify the attack. It's a very powerful, cheap, and effective card, and the fact that it doesn't cost any gauge or any life can be very important, because sometimes Dungeon World decks like to eat a lot of gauge or a lot of life, and anywhere you could save on any resources is a very good thing. Next, we have Force Summoning. It's kind of like Thundermarked Urn, except you can have a monster in your center, so you can only cast this card if you're just being attacked by your opponent. Then, what it does is counter, nullify the attack if it's not a link attack. Most of the time, it's not going to be a link attack, so it's kind of like a slightly better marked urn, in which the conditions are a bit easier, but as long as it's not a link attack, it could just nullify an attack. And then it's another defense spell that doesn't cost anything, which again is very important because anywhere you could save on resources is usually a good thing. Next we have Insanity Shivery. You can only cast this card during an attack on your opponent's turn, and you have 2 or more monsters on your field. Then you nullify the attack, choose one of the cards that attacked for this turn, and the chosen card can't stand. So you don't necessarily have to use this effect on the card that just attacked. You could use it on a different card that had already attacked, and making it not stand is a very powerful effect because a lot of the times they want to either restand using double attack, triple attack, quadruple attack, or whatever, or they have a spell that they want to use where it stands up a card or their board, and this just helps shut them down. On top of which, it doesn't have a gauge cost, which again is still a very good thing because anywhere you could save on resources, the better. Next we have Razed Castletown. So you can only cast this card if you have 2 or more monsters on your field, then counter, rest a monster on your opponent's field. It's pretty short, sweet, and simple. It's a very solid, easy to play rest spell. Next we have Dangerous Fuse. So this is a pretty interesting and convoluted card, but at the end of the day, what it really does is you either draw 2 or gain 2 based on the sheer randomization of revealing the top card and shuffling it back in and seeing if your opponent picks the same card name, which most of the time it's going to whiff. Depending on the deck, if you're playing lots and lots and lots of 4-ofs or 3-ofs, it could possibly hit, and if it does, it's a draw 2. If it whiffs, it's a gauge 2, which either way, it's not a bad card. Next, we have Golden Treasurebox. So you can only cast this card if you have 6 or less life. That's probably the worst thing about the card, but everything else about the card is pretty solid. So what it does is you put the top card of your deck into your drop zone. If it's a monster, you draw cards equal to the size of that monster. If not, then you basically get to charge 1 and gauge 1. So if it hits, you could possibly draw 1 or more cards. If it whiffs, you charge 1 and draw 1. So either way, it's still not a bad card. Next, we have Reset Button. So Reset Button is a pretty interesting card in which if you have 1 or more gauge, you basically reset your gauge, except you reset your gauge to 4 gauge instead of 2 gauge. So most of the time, you're going to want to use this card when you have 1 gauge. Then this is basically like you're charging 3 gauge. It's pretty good. Even if you need to use it to gain 3 or 1 gauge, it's still a pretty solid card. And on top of which, you get a free shuffle of your deck, which can or can't be important depending on who you're facing or how your deck tends to work. Next, we have Unfreezing. So for the cost of paying a life, you get to basically look at the top 3 cards of your deck, put 1 of them into your hand, and bottom the rest in any order. So again, digging and drawing is very important, and this card does both, where you dig through the top 3 and you pick one of them and you basically just draw it. So it's just a very powerful effect that a lot of worlds tend to have. Next we have Bonus Quest. So Bonus Quest is a very powerful card in which cast cost is discarding a size 2 or greater monster from your hand. Then you basically charge 2, gain 1 life, and draw 2. So not only is it replacing the card that you just discarded, it's also giving you an additional card on top of gaining you life and charging you 2 gauge, which, again, gaining gauge can be very important in Dungeon World depending on how your deck works. So this is just a very, very strong and effective card. Next, we have Mission Card Quest Start. So Dungeon World has these mission cards where they're set spells, and then once they have a condition to get cards into its soul, and then once it reaches a certain number of cards in its soul, it destroys itself, and you get a very powerful effect. So the condition for getting souls is your opponent is dealt damage, and you put the top card of your deck into its soul face down. It's per instance of damage, not per damage they've taken, but the fact that it's per instance and it's not locked to once per turn is very powerful because of its other ability. At the end of your turn, if this card has 3 or more cards in its soul, put this card from your field to the drop zone, you gain 3 life, draw 3 cards, and deal 3 damage to your opponent. Not only are you draining them for 3, you're also drawing 3 cards, and even though it's at the end of your turn, it helps you get out some defense spells, so that way you could defend on your opponent's turn if this card didn't kill them. Because the easiest way to trigger this card is basically just attack them 3 times, and then that's 3 separate instances of damage, or get 3 attacks through, and then this will just help burn for even more damage. And even if you delay this card, still that effect is very strong. Next, we have Delusions Run Amok. So you can cast this card during either player's attack phase. Its cast cost is destroy a monster on your field. Then you basically just charge 4. So it's a counter speed, charge 4, and the only restrictions and requirements is destroying a monster, and it has to be during the attack phase. But if you're trying to cast an impact or play other cards during the combat step, this is a very powerful card nonetheless. Next we have Glory Burst. So if you're not playing Knights, you only care about the first ability, which is you basically get to tutor out any card with mission in its name from your deck and add it to your hand. Obviously, there's some pretty good mission cards depending on how you build the deck, but the fact that it tutors out a mission card is the primary use for anything but Knights. If you are playing Knights, you can call a Knight monster from your drop zone by paying its call cost. If you're playing Knights, you have that option. If you're not playing Knights, you just care about tutoring out that mission card, which usually the mission cards are very good. And then its cast cost is only paying a life, so it's not eating at your gauge, so you could use your gauge for other things. Next, we have Chaos Orser. So I don't want to call this the Daryl Burke of Dungeon World, but he kind of has a similar style of play where you play him. He has a effect, and it can only be used once a turn, but it's a pretty powerful effect when it goes off. So what it does is when this card enters the field, you may put 2 monsters and a spell from your drop zone to the bottom of your deck in any order. If you do, you charge 1, gain 1 life, and draw a card. And then, again, you can only use this effect once per turn. He's just there to help return cards to the deck, on top of which he's gaining you a gauge, gaining you a life, and drawing you a card, which all of those things are very good things. Next, we have Yellowbat. This is kind of the Garcat of Dungeon World. So what Garcat does is if you just have another Deity Dragon Tribe card on your field, you basically draw 1 and gauge 1. So what Yellowbat does is when this card enters the field, you may discard a card from your hand. If you do, charge 1 gauge. And then if you just so happen to have either a Thunder Empire card or dungeon enemy, you also get to draw a card. You gain the gauge no matter what, and the cost of just discarding a card isn't always the worst thing depending on how you're building your deck, but just the fact that he can gain a gauge in basically any deck is very powerful, and if you just so happen to have another dungeon enemy card, could be an item, could be another monster, could be a set spell, doesn't really matter, or Thunder Empire, same thing, you get to draw a card. And then lastly, I have Staff of Polarization. Even though this card really only works in adventurers and dungeon enemies, the fact that this card is considered a adventurer and dungeon enemy card is very important. But what this card does is, to equip it, you pay 1 gauge and put the top card of your deck into its soul. Then, if you have an adventurer monster on your field, this card and all monster cards on your field can't be destroyed by card effects, and they gain plus 6,000 power. That's pretty good. On top of which, it has another mode where if you have a dungeon enemy monster on your field, this card and all monster cards can't be bounced by your opponent's card effects, and they get plus 6,000 defense. Again, very powerful, but when you have both of them out on the field, you get both effects, and that's what really makes this weapon shine. But you don't necessarily always need both effects to make this card shine, because if you're just playing an adventurer deck and you don't have any dungeon enemy cards, this card counts as a dungeon enemy for certain effects, and then on top of which, all of your adventurers and this card still gain the adventurer effect. It is a very flexible and versatile weapon for the world. These are all the good cards that I think Dungeon World has to offer that can go into various different decks. Not all of these cards are exactly, in quotation marks, staples. Some of them don't necessarily see play, but if you're just trying to find good generic cards to act as filler for decks, or just look up what some staples are that are being used a lot, this is a good list, and this list hopefully will grow with the help of the community. And I will update the description below to add any new cards that define themselves as more staple or generically good material. That being said, I'll have a list of all of the card names in the description below if you just want to copy and paste to make searching easier. So with that being said, I hope you like this kind of content. I hope you like and subscribe for more Buddyfight content, and I will see you in the next video.